Welcome to X-Ray Juliet 823, the Avro Vulcan B2 at Solway Aviation Museum. This is the crew access ladder up which the crew of 5 would enter the aircraft for a typical mission. And for a large aircraft, the crew compartment is really surprisingly small. You've got the 2 pilots up the front, and then for a normal mission you'd have a crew of 3 in the back. On the starboard side behind the co-pilot would be the navigator radar, in the centre of the aircraft the navigator plotter, and on the port side behind the captain the air electronics officer. The pilot station definitely looks very analogue, in comparison certainly with modern aeroplanes. Lots of switches and dials up here. The systems here control everything from the fuel panel in the centre of the aircraft to hydraulics and the engines. The pilots can't actually access the aircraft with the fuel control panel where it is, so that stows forward, and then you can raise the handrails on either side of the seat, and that allows the pilots access to their section, and then the fuel control panel can stow back into position for its crucial role during the flight. You've got fighter style joystick controls rather than a traditional yoke, and then slotted in either side of the pilots, this is the captain's seat. You've got controls for various systems. The centre of the aircraft is mostly flight instruments and engines, fuel flow, that sort of thing. Throttle quadrant in the centre. Then the co-pilot seat on the right hand side, and again more system controls to his right. The pilots have ejection seats in the Vulcan. That's not the same for the rear crew, which we'll cover shortly. So if they needed to abandon the aircraft, they can pull the handle between their legs or the screen handle above their heads. And then the first thing that would happen is that the entire of the top of the canopy would blow off into the airflow. So the pilot seats would then fire out. Their parachutes are integral in the headbox in the ejection seats. So that would fire the pilots clear of the aircraft. They would try and make sure that the rear crew were out before they abandoned the aircraft, but in some cases that wasn't possible. On the throttle quadrant, the big red button you can see here is the important one, so that's the weapon release button that would release either the nuclear bomb that was the aircraft's raison d'etre or the 1,000-pound bombs that it could hold 21 of. Cockpit visibility in the Vulcan is actually pretty poor. It's not great looking forwards, and it's certainly poor looking backwards, and again that will be relevant when I talk about one of the systems that the air electronics officer had. So that's the pilot's section in the Avro Vulcan. The crew of 3 seated in the back. There are 2 different types of seats. The centre seat where the navigator plotter sat, that slides fore and aft but it doesn't swivel, whereas the seats for the air electronics officer and for the nav radar swivel as well to allow them easier access into the seats. These are known as assisted seats, which basically means that they're not ejection seats. There was no provision for that in the Vulcan. For the rear crew, the egress in an emergency was back down the crew hatch that we came up at the beginning of the video. They're called assisted seats, so underneath the seat cushion was what's best imagined as a whoopee cushion, which can inflate on command with a pull on the handle of the seat, and that would just be able to, if the aircraft was under G when they're trying to egress, that would just give them a nudge out from the seat. Underneath this flap is the switch that will blow the hatch down. So that would force the hatch down into the airflow, and then the crew would climb down. The ladder wouldn't be there, and their egress would be effectively out through the hatch as a chute or a slide. But if the aircraft's configured for takeoff or landing, you can see, all I can see there is the nose wheel. So the aircrew manual suggests in that situation that you grab hold of the hydraulic struts on either side to swing out and avoid the undercarriage. So less than ideal, but better than nothing. On the port side, sat facing backwards behind the captain, sat the air electronics officer. And his role was largely based around systems management, managing the radios during the operational sorties of flight, managing some of the aircraft systems, but also particularly managing the passive and active countermeasures suite for the aircraft. One of those systems was the rear-facing red steer radar that allowed the AEO to clear the airspace immediately behind the aircraft to make sure no enemy fighters were sneaking up. Back in those days, fighters were generally equipped with either a gun or maybe short-range air-to-air missiles, infrared air-to-air missiles. So it just had to monitor a short area of airspace behind the aircraft. There also has a Morse code key, which you can just about make out in the gloom back there. And he also had access to a periscope, which looks out underneath the belly of the aircraft. That would allow the AEO in flight to monitor, for example, the opening and closing of the bomb bays, weapons releasing from the aircraft, that kind of thing. In the centre seat, between the other two positions, sat the nav plotter. He had responsibility for the routine navigation of the aircraft to and from either the destination or the target area. He'd be assisted in that role by the nav radar, using the radar as a sensor to update the navigation system. But he also had other equipment such as a Doppler system, and depending on the mod state of the aircraft, you might have things like TACAN or LORAN. When the aircraft was fitted for Blue Steel, the missile that you can see here, the Blue Steel missile actually had an inertial navigation unit that was regarded as being way more accurate than the aircraft's basic navigation system. So if you're on a Blue Steel mission, you could actually use the missile's inertial navigation unit to keep the aircraft's navigation system up to date. Then on the starboard side of the aircraft, sat behind the co-pilot, the nav radar seat. You can see the circular display for the H2S radar, essentially a more modern version of the radars that the Bomber Command aircraft were using towards the end of the Second World War. Approaching the target area, the control would be handed off to the nav radar, and it would be his responsibility to locate the target on the screen and get the aircraft positioned for the bombing run. If the target itself wasn't radar significant, you could actually use radar offsets to identify a radar significant target in which you knew in its position in relation to the actual target, maybe a dam wall or a harbour or a mast or a large building, and identifying that and marking it on the radar would update the nav system to allow accurate release of the weapons on target. Over in the corner, there's a red flap underneath which is another weapon release button for the nav radar, so that gave redundancy to ensure that whatever happened, weapons release occurred successfully. The joystick control is what allowed the nav radar to control the H2S system and update either the navigation kit or the weapon aiming system. On both sides of the aircraft, behind the two swivel seats, are panels which hide numerous wires, fuses, circuit breakers relating to all the electronic equipment in the aircraft. So you can see there were miles and miles of electrical wiring in the Vulcan. It was a largely electrical aircraft, so there were miles and miles of that wiring. One of the air electronics officer's duties, if something failed, would be to pull out a checklist, figure out what had failed, where the relevant fuse or circuit breaker was, get that panel open and see if they could get the equipment running again. 3 panels of that on each side of the aircraft, so pretty complex business. Besides the 5 main crew positions, the Vulcan could actually carry an additional 2 personnel. So immediately behind the co-pilot, the jump seat or 6th seat was typically used to carry maybe an instructor if the crew were on a training sortie or an instructional sortie, or you could carry an engineering crew chief if you were landing away at a different base. And there was actually a 7th position on the port side behind the captain. It's not as it's set up here for us at the moment, but it was effectively a sort of fold-down deck chair arrangement which allowed the carriage of that additional person. So if you ever flew in a Vulcan as an air cadet, you'd probably have flown in one of those 2 seats. Underneath the pilot station, there is actually a visual bomb aiming station. Now, this was built in because, frankly, the bombers in the Second World War had them, and so they thought it would be useful to have. But the reality was that with the H2S radar, that was far more accurate for bombing, for everything except perhaps very low-level bombing. So they came up with other uses for this. One of which was to mount a camera that would be used to film the bombing runs for the crews in training or indeed for real. Our aircraft was one of the aircraft modified for the maritime role, so you could put a much more powerful camera in there to monitor Soviet shipping. A third use for this area was that you could actually mount a chemical toilet in here, which on long journeys would have been a bit of a godsend because your only other alternative was the rubber pee bags that were provided. And then a fourth use for this area, if the aircraft was landing away at another base or going on an overseas training flight, you could bet your life this area would be used to fill up with crew luggage, and on the way home it would be stacked full of duty-free beer. Another oddity worth mentioning is these odd-looking objects. There's one here behind the captain's seat, one behind the co, and then in the rear, for the rear crew there, down by their feet. And these are actually electric can heaters. So this would allow the crew to take a tin of soup or stew or something with them, and on longer journeys they could put a tin in here, lob it back in the container. There's a 28 volt coil heater around the outside there that would allow you to heat up your sustenance to keep you going through the flight. If you didn't do that, then your alternative was to use packed lunch. So that was our cockpit tour of the Avro Vulcan. If you've got any questions, pop them down in the comments.